I've always admired someone who says what I'm thinking, and that someone is Chris. I'm not the only one who feels that way. Recently, the Daily Kos, which is an outlet for political blogging, wrote this about one of his all-in programs. I have yet to see any TV host hit the Trump administration as hard as Chris Hayes did on this episode of All In. Chris Hayes did not pull any punches as he completely eviscerated the Trump administration for a White House defined by lies. Hayes started the segment showing a moment that illustrated the dishonesty of the Trump administration. A reporter asked Trump's press secretary, Sean Spicer, if Trump believed the Jobs report now, given his attack on them a few months back. Without blinking and with a smirk, he said, Trump said the reports might have been phony in the past, but they are real now. Everyone in the room laughed. Hayes said, the White House is full of it, they know it, and they know that reporters know it, and they don't care. You see not a single thing that emanates from this White House that can ever be immediately believed. But Chris's reputation as a no-holds-barred commentator goes back a ways. In fact, it goes back to his previous TV show, Up with Chris Hayes, which was also on MSNBC. In fact, I must say my favorite comments about Chris were from a 2012 LA Weekly article. It first asked the question, what is it that fascinates about Up with Chris Hayes, MSNBC's almost one-year-old alternative to weekend talking points, pit stops, Face the Nation, and Meet the Press? And this is the answer. Is it that the bespectacled former go-to stand-in for Rachel Maddow with the enviably dewy complexion seems to genuinely care about drawing his weekly roundtable of pundits, experts, and political officials into a smart, clear-headed discussion of current events? Or is it that the literary references and fine print factoids that flow like water from the fast-talking 33-year-old journalist make you long for him to be at your side, or at the very least, to supply you with a crib sheet of brainy, irrefutable comebacks the next time your crazy right-wing uncle brays anti-choice, homophobic Bertha hogwash? I love it. Chris Hayes.
Well, thanks for coming out on a snowy day, and thank you all for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I guess I thought I would talk a little bit about my trajectory as a journalist, and then talk a little bit about how I see journalism right now in the incredibly contested epoch that we have entered into. Although I think the epoch sort of began before Trump. How's that? Okay. I'm going to wander a little. So I was born in the Bronx. My father was a community organizer. He's an ex-Jesuit. He was actually a Jesuit seminarian who started becoming a community organizer. He and his cohort of Jesuits moved into a building on Marion Avenue in the South Bronx that happened to be an apartment above the one that my mom grew up in. And they met. Next thing you know, he has left the Jesuits, which was a stroke of luck for me, for a whole bunch of reasons. And my mom was a public school teacher for years, and then worked at a nonprofit in the Bronx called Bronx Council of the Arts, and she went back into the system where she managed arts and education in the Bronx. And my dad worked for years for community organizations, and then worked in public health in East Harlem. He's retired now. They're both retired. And I grew up I would say, a kind of middle-class outer borough kid in the Bronx. When I was 12, I tested into Hunter High School, which is a magnet school here in New York City, and would commute down. And it was a really amazing experience. It was sort of mind-blowing. remember one of my first days at Hunter was a half day, and I was friends with all these sort of affluent, children of the Upper West and Upper East Side bourgeois. And we were going to go see a movie that was like 10 blocks away, and like we got huddled into a cab. I was like, we can't, this is going to be $100. We can't get in a cab. Only rich people get into cabs. Then it turned out to be like $2 a person because 7 of us piled in the car. So I went to Hunter, and then from Hunter I started doing theater. In fact, I directed Lin-Manuel Miranda's first musical at Hunter. Lin and I were really good friends. We did theater together. He wrote a musical his junior year and my senior year called Nightmare in G Major, which I can still hum, which gives you a sense that he had that from the moment that I first met him when we were taking the express bus together, him back up to Inwood, me back up to the Bronx, after theater rehearsal, which is how we met and became friends. And after Brown, I did a lot of theater in Brown too, and then after Brown, my then girlfriend and now wife moved to Chicago. And it was towards the end of my time as an undergrad that I kind of thought to myself that as I was considering what to do out in the world, that if I could somehow trick people into paying me to learn, then that would be the best possible outcome in the real world. Like right now I'm paying to learn, but if I could somehow reverse that and get people to pay me to learn stuff, that seems like what I'd like to do. And so I moved to Chicago, and I basically just started pitching the Chicago Reader. Chicago Reader is a weekly alternative paper. People familiar with the Chicago Reader? It's great paper. My father-in-law was a political reporter at the local ABC station, and he knew one of the editors of the Reader, and I just started sending him clips, and I got a byline, and I still remember my first byline. The Chicago Reader would be printed, and it would come out on Thursday afternoon, and it would be dropped off in vans that would make their way up the north side in various bars and bookstores and things like that. And I still remember on a cold winter day getting in the bus down Clark to go south, to get as far south so that I could hurry up and get the paper earlier than it would take for it to creep up the north side, because I was so excited to have a byline that I took it down to 16 to North Avenue, and I got one. So I started. I kind of started as a freelance reporter in Chicago and hustling, basically. My wife worked in a domestic violence courtroom as a victim's advocate, and then she went to law school. And the whole time I had odd jobs. I waited tables for a while. I'd sort of write contract stuff on the side, but I basically just hustled as a freelancer. And I really learned how to be a reporter from the Reader, from the great editors of the Reader, which is just a phenomenal place. It was just a real... It was a place that took journalism very seriously and had extremely high standards, and kicked my ass a little bit because I thought I knew everything. I still cringe when I think about going back and forth with the second story I wrote with an editor who had taken out some very long-winded, discursive rumination that I had put in and thought was extremely smart. And what a brat I was to him about the fact he had cut my deathless prose. From there, I started. I got a job. I started writing for had been founded as a socialist newspaper called In These Times in Chicago, by a guy named Jimmy Weinstein, who's a sort of local legend, fascinating guy. And I had started freelancing pieces for them. This was sort of in the Bush era, and they ended up hiring me on staff thanks to Bill Moyers, who sort of had found my writing and liked it and gave them a grant for a year through the Schumann Foundation to hire me. And from there, I started writing for The Nation for a year, and then my wife got a clerkship with Justice John Paul Stevens in Washington, D.C., and we moved to D.C., and I didn't know what I was going to do, and then through complete luck, a few months after I moved to D.C., David Korn, who's the longtime bureau chief of The Nation, moved over to Mother Jones, thus creating a vacancy as the bureau chief of The Nation magazine in Washington, D.C., and Katrina Vanden Heuvel, to whom I am forever grateful, gave me that job. And it was from writing as it was a very exciting time. This is the 2008 election, the financial crash. It was an incredibly intense time. I still remember going to my first hearing in D.C. when I moved there, which was a hearing of the Joint Economic Committee that is part House, part Senate, right? So the JUC has representatives from both houses, and they bring the Fed chair to come in and testify. And this is in 2007, in the summer of 2007. I still remember this is my first hearing on Capitol Hill as a reporter in this context, and I went to this hearing and I watched Elijah Cummings in Baltimore, Maryland berate Ben Bernanke after Ben Bernanke had just told this entire committee that basically everything's okay, the losses that are coming out of subprime can be sustained, and basically everything's gonna be okay. And Elijah Cummings saying to Ben Bernanke, "You should come to my neighborhood because I am telling you right now that it's not okay and it's not gonna be okay." It's always stuck with me as sort of a great little microcosm lesson about who knows what, right? The value of expertise versus the value of broad grassroots democratic input, right? In some ways, one of the geniuses of democracy is as a means of funneling information when it's functioning well. One of the lessons of autocracy and monarchy is that when you constrain the inputs of information by empowering a very small group of people, you create massive blind spots. And at its best, right, a democracy functions as a way, both in a sort of moral sense, it functions because it endows everybody with the dignity of collective self-determination. But in a kind of cognitive, informational sense, a democracy functions because it collects the information of a broad group of people who then channel it through representatives. And you saw another example of this in New Hampshire in the primaries, when all of a sudden no one in D.C. was talking about the opioid crisis, but people had to start going to town halls in New Hampshire, and town hall after town hall after town hall after town hall, what do people want to talk about? Opioids, right? And politician after politician after politician has to ask people what's happening, how many people here have lost someone to opioids, and all the hands go up, right? So I always remember that moment in Washington, and I think it sort of informed some of the way I think about reporting and democracy, because I happened to be in Washington at a moment when there was this just sort of pile up of experts and elites getting it wrong. And I wrote my first book about that, which came out in 2012. It's called Twilight of the Elites. And it's about the crisis of authority in American life and the fact that the vacuum of institutional crisis, of institutional trust, was probably going to lead to some kind of strong man rising out of the ashes. So from the Nation, I started appearing on MSNBC as a guest, and from a guest to being a guest host, and then I was given my own show up in the September 2011. I was given the primetime 8 p.m. show on April 1st, 2013. We took air just as sort of the show started just as the air came out of the bubble of political interest in this country. Because 2013, in some ways, is the beginning of was the last chapter of a story that had gripped the nation for 5 years from the rise of Barack Obama. Once he'd been reelected, there's some sort of, okay, well, what's the story now? And we had a Washington that was deadlocked between a Republican Congress and a Democratic president. Ratings across all political enterprises, traffic, all went basically down. I had the good fortune of taking a show on at that point. It was unbelievably stressful. I was completely unprepared for the pressure of nightly television, particularly the ratings pressure. At 30 Rock every day at 4:15, there's an email that goes out to everyone that works in the building, which is a spreadsheet that compares everyone's ratings across all the cable news networks in 15-minute increments from 5 a.m. in the morning to 2 a.m. And, you know, it's like being graded for your workday yesterday. It's like walking around your workplace with a big B- that everybody sees all the time. It's just the constant, and I found that, well, frankly, as a lifelong A student, I found that brutal because I spent a long time getting C's and everyone knowing it. So I think I sort of slowly acclimated to the job and grew into it a bit. We're rating better than we ever have, than anyone has in the network in 8 years or so. And so now we find ourselves in this, so now I find myself in this position of hosting this show at this moment in American journalism and American history. And I feel incredibly lucky to be able to do it. The work feels, the job has never been harder and it's never felt more urgent than it does now. It's sort of simultaneously invigorating and exhausting. And there's a few things that make it that, and I thought maybe I'd talk a little bit about my perspective on journalism in this moment. So one thing that makes it exhausting is the degree to which you cannot trust anything the White House says. Now, there's a certain extent to which that's just generally true about anyone in power, right? I mean, the whole idea in the way as a journalist you cover anyone in power is that you don't think like presumptively they're right. You know, the old, if your mother says she loves you, check it out, right? So you gotta confirm everything. You have to be skeptical. But there's a certain degree to which covering any administration rests on being able to trust them on a whole variety of just essentially trivial facts. Like, the president's gonna go to this place tomorrow. Right? Like non-controversial things that just like logistically you need to know. Even that you can't trust. My favorite example of this, the most acute example of this was the Friday they issued the executive order on immigration, okay? Now, in a normal administration, there would be a desire and an incentive on the part of the administration for the press to get it right. Right? And part of what's so perverse about the relationship that's developed in this case is that I firmly believe the White House hopes we get stuff wrong and is actively seeking to create the conditions under which they do so that they can then turn around and say fake news. On the Friday they released the executive order, the President of the United States, in front of cameras at 4:15, signed the executive order. Ergo, at 4:15, the text of the order is extant and available. We did not get it till 7:30. So 3 hours go by in which the president has just signed this incredibly important executive order that involves what, frankly, for my money, is the most complicated area of law, which is immigration law. And rather than doing what a normal White House would do, which is that early that morning they would have had a background briefing with a senior administration official with a phone in where people could call and ask questions in advance to make sure that we're not getting stuff wrong and it's clarified. We heard not word one. He signs it at 4:15, and they drop the text at 7:30. So they are hoping. I mean, they're doing nothing, even from this sort of selfish perspective of wanting us to understand it, right? So immediately, a immediate question is green cards. Do green cards apply? Unclear. It's unclear in the text of the executive order. We would later learn that it was so unclear that DHS determined green cards did not apply, but DHS's interagency process was overruled by Stephen Bannon and Stephen Miller. But that is a little microcosm of the challenge of dealing with this White House every day. They are both untrustworthy. They're unreliable narrators of their own story. The president chief among them, but everyone around him. B, they have a set of incentives in which they're constantly, in their own way, kind of laying landmines for us in hopes that we get things wrong. Which is the reverse of the way it usually works, right? The other challenge is just the sheer scale of everything. So people talk all the time about this or that as a distraction from this or that, and it's true that the sheer quantity of news that's being made is overwhelming, and even with an hour show every night, which is 5 hours a week, is a lot of it's a lot of time to be on air. I constantly am going home every night frustrated we didn't cover X, Y, or Z. Like today, for instance, they're rolling back the fuel economy standards, which is going to be bad for consumers and also bad for the environment, and is essentially just a gimme for the auto industry, which wants it. I don't even know if that's going to make the show, because that probably is not in the top 6 things that happened today. And the sheer quantity of news forces a decision-making process that is very intense, because you're just making more decisions than normal, right? You're constantly deciding this or this, this or this, this or this, and there's a whole literature in psychology and cognitive science about decision fatigue, which is that if you force people to make a lot of decisions, like, they get worse at it over time, because like reps on a bench press, you start to get fatigued, exhausted. And so I find myself feeling decision fatigue every day, where you kind of want to just be like, okay, let's just do whatever is easiest. And that's a sort of temptation you have to resist. You have to kind of like grit your teeth and and sort of put your back into lifting the weights again. But it requires some self-discipline and it requires some motivation because the sheer number of decisions to make is so overwhelming and exhausting. There's two more challenges. So the third challenge is there is a line from Crime and Punishment that has been echoing in my head since the election. And it's a line that is sort of echoed itself in Nietzsche, which is, if God is dead, is all permitted. And there's a little bit in which it sometimes feels like there's a temptation in the wake of Trump's victory to give into total nihilism. Like, if Donald Trump is president, then is all permitted. In the sense that if this person, that because Donald Trump takes shortcuts, because Donald Trump doesn't care about the truth, because Donald Trump cuts corners, because Donald Trump dissembles and obfuscates and frankly deceives, because the people around him do all that, there's this temptation that it's sort of okay for everyone to do that. That like, none of it matters anymore. That we're in some kind of valueless, sort of untethered postmodern universe where we're so detached from any reality that everything is just sort of will to power. Everything is whether you could convince enough people that are in your tribe to believe you. And the basic fundamental values of open and honest, rigorous collective exchange have been destroyed. And as a descriptive matter, I think that's largely true. Donald Trump, the nature of partisan polarization and the nature of Trump as an individual combined mean that he can single-handedly shape people's beliefs in all sorts of insane ways. I genuinely believe that if Donald Trump decided tomorrow to tell everyone that 9/11 was an inside job, about 30 to 40% of the country would believe 9/11 was an inside job. I really believe that. I mean, in some ways, the idea that 3 million people voted illegally is no more or less preposterous than the idea that the Bush administration pulled off 9/11. I mean, just from a sheer cognitive level, like the amount of illicit and secretive coordination that would be required to pull off either of those are roughly equivalent. And the president routinely traffics in conspiracy theories. He's a conspiratorial thinker. And so there's this sort of weird temptation, which is like this kind of leveling down or this race to the bottom where the person who is the most powerful person in the country is sort of playing by this set of rules, has thrown out the rule book, and a sort of question about whether everyone in response to that is it preposterous to continue to hold yourself to a standard? And my strong belief on this is that you have to double down on the values that you adhere to. Like, everything has to be fact-checked even more than it ever was because they're trying to trick us. And everything has to be rock solid, and we have to make sure that all of our basic principles as journalists, as citizens, are just reinforced and sort of leaned into more than they've ever been, as opposed to giving way to this temptation to essentially mirror the epistemic style of the president. And then the final thing that I would say, which is a challenge that is much larger than Donald Trump, but one that he took inordinate advantage of and continues to. I have come to believe that the most valuable commodity in the 21st century, by far, is not land, it's not water, it's not fossil fuels, it's attention. Attention is, and I mean this in a really like real sense, like in terms of value. The reason Facebook is valued at what it is because it is grabbing so much of so many people's attention. Like, in any given moment, you are looking at this thing or that thing. And in some ways, it's finite, right? It's a fixed pie. And there's a war happening for that attention. What do you watch? Where do you put your eyeballs? The competition for it has gotten more fierce than ever. The methods of drawing that attention have gotten more sophisticated than ever, right? There's something just almost opioid-like about a smartphone, right? It is operating at a sort of neural level of seduction and addiction that is profound and intense. And we all, in the for-profit part of the news world, are part of that battle. Every night, I need people to watch my show. In some ways, above anything else. That is the necessary precondition for me continuing in my job, is for people to watch. And the war for attention and the more competitive it gets, right, the more tabloid news gets. And I say tabloid advisedly for this reason. When we talk about tabloid news, right, that's a very specific thing we're indicating. When you go to a newspaper rack in England, where the tabloids are still robust, there are 10 different options, and they are fighting for your attention. And that's why the front pages look like they do. It's not an accident, right? In fact, when we look at the heyday of great journalism, right, a lot of it is the product of essentially comfortable monopolies, right? When you have comfortable monopolies and you don't have to war for people's attention, when people just come to you, right, you can take a little more leisure, right? If the New Yorker had to make a profit, which it doesn't, just so we're all clear, the New Yorker does not make a profit. It is subsidized by Condé Nast every year as a sort of prestige publication. If the New Yorker had to make a profit, it would not look like the New Yorker. There is a deep, profound, and unavoidable trade-off between depth and, in some cases, quality and attention. It's why tabloids are the way they are, right? So I find myself literally in the middle of that crosshair because I have to get 1.8, 1.7 million people to watch my show every night. I have to deliver those numbers. What demand is, I can feel it. I've gotten good at feeling it. You get good at feeling it, right? It's like a rat in the maze. That spreadsheet is, to extend the metaphor, that spreadsheet is the little dose of sugar or cocaine, right, for the rat in the maze. So I see that spreadsheet at 4:15, and that's the dose that says that teaches me how to run the maze. Right? And then I go back and run the maze again, and then I get it, and I get it, and I get it. And guess what? Humans are very good at learning. So you learn. Now, what happens when the demand is pushing you in a direction that is at conflict with what's important? Or the demand is pushing you in a direction that's at conflict with your journalistic values, right? That's what I mean about these decisions that we're constantly making. We are trying to steer a course that produces something that is both entertaining and attention-grabbing more than entertaining, right? Keeps people's attention and also lives up to what my and our show's journalistic values are. That we're not doing things that are cheap. That we're not doing things like mocking people that we're not punching down, that we're not mocking or ridiculing people that are not powerful. That we're not engaged in conspiracy theorizing, that we are not taking what is flashy and grabby at the cost of what's important and substantive. But those decisions are hard decisions. I can tell you, we have not covered the war in Syria hardly at all. And I can also tell you the war in Syria will not rate. Will not rate. I've tried it, believe me. It will not rate. A lot of what people hate about the media is driven by demand. And it's driven by demand not by people's sort of prefrontal cortex, but by their kind of reptilian brain, right? Like, one way I think about it is being a wedding DJ, okay? So if you're a wedding DJ, okay? Like, your job as a wedding DJ is not to play the best music. And in fact, it would be like a complete misunderstanding of the genre to sit at a wedding and be like, but those aren't the best songs that have been written. That's not the point of the wedding DJ. The point of the wedding DJ is to get you to get up and dance, to get people on the floor. And the place in your brain that makes the decision about whether to do that isn't here, it's back here, right? And what appeals to back here doesn't necessarily appeal to what's here. You may have written your ethnomusicology thesis about an incredible orchestral arrangement by Tuvalu singers, okay? But that does nothing to indicate whether you're gonna get up or dance or not, okay? Everyone right now that's working in the media, whether it's in digital, particularly digital or TV, is trying to get people to dance. And you can say, well, that's bad. Well, yeah, it is in a lot of ways. But that's a question of how the market's structured and what the incentives are, right? And one of the things that's happened is digital has gotten less like print and more like TV, right? Because it is increasingly the same competition, market, intentional incentives of television. So when people talk about clickbait, which is the term that has replaced tabloid, right? We say clickbait instead of tabloid now, which is a sort of like medium updating. All that means is like, yeah, yes, that is clickbait in the sense of I'm trying to get you to click. And my response to people who say, well, that's clickbait. It's like, totally, yes, and I get that. And there's a lot of crap out there. But they have to get you to click, right? So the challenge for all of us is like, how do we, and there's no easy answer. I don't have an answer for it, right? Just how do you take what the market incentives and competition for attention have done to what we in the for-profit media have to do and marry that to a set of journalistic standards. And sometimes that's personal. There are times, lots of times when I make a decision to cover something knowing that it will cost me viewers. I do that all the time, and it's just like, we're just gonna take the hit on this because I wanna do this, because this is important. But I can't do that for the full hour every night. Sometimes you're handed a story like the healthcare fight that is perfectly right in the middle of the Venn diagram, right? So going to work today is fun because I have a big story that's right in the middle of these two things. There's demand for it. People want to see the healthcare fight, and it's super important. It's absolutely 100% substantive, newsworthy thing. And those are in some ways, those are the most fun days at work, right? I'm not making this sort of decision. The thing that I always tell people, and now I'll use another slightly tortured metaphor from the wedding DJ, is that, you know, when I got a television show, I thought I got a sports car. Like, I thought it was like, oh, literally someone's like throwing me the keys. And I'm like, thanks. And then I like walk in, I like swing open the door, I like get behind. It's like, well, I'm just gonna go where I wanna go. Like, open road. And really what you have is a sailboat. You can't just like hop in the sailboat and like, psh. Like A, you have to figure out what the hell you're doing. And B, you cannot sail into the wind. You can drive anywhere you want to drive. You can't sail into the wind. What you learn to do on a sailboat is to take the wind and to take where you want to go and to marry them to each other to sort of chart your course. And that's been the kind of learning curve for me in this job. And I think I've gotten much better at it, as you know, as people are wont to do when they do something over and over. But none of this is, in some ways, it's just an eternal struggle every day. Like there's no set of fixed answers to these trade-offs. It's part of what is so draining about the job. There's the job, and then there's the sort of moral freight of making those decisions all the time, which I feel very deeply. Like, and there's no permanent equilibrium to achieve. There's no ultimate resolution of the trade-offs at which I can say, we have now decided the way we deal with this issue. No, every day it's the same thing over and over. It's making those decisions over and over. All right, questions?
Chris, that was great. And as a proud Hunter College High School parent and the brother of an actress and a blues musician in Chicago, now I finally get you really more deeply. Tax returns. I think it's quite conceivable that Donald Trump is lying awake nights, not to mention Sean Spicer, about April 15 and what to do about the first tax return that you cannot in any way assert is under audit. So maybe he looked at his tax returns and said, Jesus, the best tax return I ever had was 2005. Send it to David K. Johnson. I guess my point, the only argument I have with what you said so far is that actually tax law is way more complicated than immigration law. And so what I am suggesting actually is, and I'd like your take on this, I think the story from now, the story that's been most ignored, is what's going to happen to the Internal Revenue Service, and therefore the finances of the United States.
So, that's a great point. I mean, so a few things on the IRS front, right? So the budget sketches we know are going to hammer the agency. Of course, it's been hammered before. It was really hammered post Gingrich Contract with America. We know that there's a huge and growing amount of uncollected taxes because of that. We also know that audit focus, particularly during the Bush administration, shifted from the top to the bottom, right? They started doing way more audits of people claiming EITC, which was, they sort of bumped in their algorithm. So there's a sort of integrity and capacity of the IRS, which I think is a genuine concern, particularly given who the President of the United States is. There's also the independence of it, right? Which is also a concern, a la the DOJ, which is like, remember, the president called up the person. I had this story and I couldn't break it because I only had one source, which goes back to the point I was making in the beginning. I was very tempted to run with it for one source. I was like, well, I have one source. But I was like, no, can't do it. And then I got scooped. The story that I had was that the president called up the acting director of the Park Service to be like, you better find me some photos of more people at the inauguration. This happened the morning after he was inaugurated. This was broken by the Washington Post. And I had this story and I had it from one source. Point being, what's to stop the president from calling someone in the IRS and say,
or Jeff Sessions, who's in charge.
Exactly, right. So there's a real question about the integrity and independence of the IRS in the same way there is with the Department of Justice, right? Writ large. A. B, on the taxes. In terms of what happened last night, like I think maybe Trump leaked them himself. My feeling about the taxes is this. They got confirmation from the White House that these are the president's taxes. First time ever. That is news. I mean, whatever. I'm not going to get petty here. But I saw there was all sorts of criticism on Twitter and online, and that's fine. People can criticize and whatever. But any news outlet in this country would kill for that. For 2 pages of the 1040 of the President of the United States who hasn't released his taxes, that's news, right? Building up to your point about April 15th, I 100% agree. Now,
Give up health care and get off the hamster.
No, I'm not giving up. I'm not giving up healthcare. I mean, I just looked in the eyes of people in the poorest county in West Virginia who could take it on the chin. Thank you. I mean, there's 2 things about April 15th. One is they're going to file for an extension. Don't you think? Like, because what else are they going to do? Like, they can't. I mean, but then there's only so many extensions. But what are they going to do? If they don't file for an extension, the president filed his taxes today. Okay. You have them. Can we see them? No. Why not? They're under audit? No, they can't be under audit. You just filed them. Right? So you're 100% right. They are up against it April 15th. And this is an annual tradition. The president files his taxes and they're released to the public. You know, this is what they do. So I strongly suspect they're going to file for an extension. Because if I were they, just kick the can. Right. I mean, the other thing is they can't outrun it, right? I mean, eventually the president of the United States has to file taxes. But I completely agree with you that they're in a corner on this one. Because the lie that they've told, which I believe is a lie about this audit thing, is not applicable this year. And it's the first year he's actually sitting president. And the president of the United States has to pay his taxes. And so I think they're going to file for an extension because I think they're going to try to kick the can down the road. But that doesn't solve the problem in perpetuity. And in fact, it only escalates, right? The sort of mounting pressure, right? The longer you put it off, I suppose they could what they've done on a billion things is just brazenly say, the president filed his taxes, and, you know, that's it.
Is it a news story?
Yeah, it's a news story.
Okay, Alan, let me add something. Everything under the sun has been hacked. How long will it take for the IRS forms that he did file to be hacked?
So that's a good question. I am not a sophisticated enough tech person to know the likelihood. What I do know is that one of the things that has been amazing is that, and I suspect you would agree, is that the institutional culture of the IRS is incredible. Right? I mean, compare the IRS to the FBI. Right? FBI, it's every day there's a leak. In the run up to the election day, it was unnamed sources talking to this and that reporter and Rudy Giuliani and whoever, Brett Baer at Fox News, saying we're investigating Clinton cash and we're investigating this and that. No one from the IRS is talking to anyone about anything, as it should be, right? Because they are entrusted with this incredible duty to protect the privacy of American citizens. So, as for whether it gets hacked, I mean, look, there's some hard drive somewhere that stored the president's taxes. His accountant, his lawyer. Are those like super secure systems that are air-gapped and encrypted? Probably not. You know, the president's running around with an unsecure phone as far as we can tell. So, yeah, if the president's tax returns got hacked, would I be shocked? No.
Thank you. Love your show. You're awesome. One of the things you do very well is connect the dots. Could you connect some dots? It's well recognized that Donald Trump is not an intellectual.
I will stipulate that dot. Yes,
Okay.
Continue.
It's pretty well recognized that Steve Bannon, on the other hand, is an intellectual. Very well read, very, depth of knowledge. Okay. Steve Bannon has announced many, many times that he wishes to, quote, destroy democracy. He can't, next dot, he can't be wanting to destroy it to make Donald Trump our dictator. What does he want? Does he want to be the dictator? What is his agenda?
Well, I think Steve Bannon has a worldview that is way more coherent than the president's, to your point. I think he wants power, and I think he has it through the personage of Donald Trump. I don't know, I honestly don't know what the ultimate end game for him is. I think he wants, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, calls his model illiberal democracy. And it's a kind of Herrenvolk, sort of quasi-authoritarian, but functionally democratic republic, where the right is extremely empowered. There's a neo-fascist party that occasionally goes on rampages and beats up immigrants. And that has passed a bunch of sort of reactionary measures on things like abortion and marriage and church and things like that. And I think that something like that is probably the preferred system for Bannon.
That's a small, homogeneous population.
Yeah. Yeah, which is what makes the vision of that here so terrifying. I mean, I think Steve Bannon's worldview is essentially an ethno-nationalist country that is ordered around a shared set of racial and cultural attributes. Yeah, right. And we played tape last night of Steve King and Steve Bannon on Steve King being on Steve Bannon's show, telling each other how right they are about everything. This book that I talked about last night, this book called Camp of the Saints, which if you get a chance to look at it, I would recommend. I first encountered it when I first started reporting on the anti-immigrant right back in like 2005. It's a dystopic French novel published in the 1980s about basically hordes of Asian and African migrants invading Europe and destroying white society. It's a shockingly racist tome. It's 3 clicks away from Protocols of Elders of Zion. It's garbage. It's racist garbage. Steve Bannon loves the book, recommends it all the time. Steve King, in the interview he did on talk radio yesterday after doubling down on the sentiment of somebody else's babies, told people at the end of it to read Camp of the Saints. So in terms of what Bannon's personal aspirations are, I think he wants power and I think he wants to be close to power. But I do think he, and this is where I think, what he and Vladimir Putin have in common, which I think they have common aims that can look like collusion, but actually want the same thing, which is to destroy the post-1945 international liberal order as we know it. All of the stuff that got created in the ruins of it, which is the beginning of the coal and steel exchange, which leads to the EU, the institutions of the World Bank and IMF and NATO, lots of institutions which, by the way, have done terrible things and performed incredibly poorly and need to be either scrapped or reformed in all kinds of ways. But fundamentally, the post-war liberal order that has, let's be clear, kept the world out of a world war since then, which is something that we don't appreciate enough, particularly as a generation of people who experienced fascism and World War die off, that he wants to scrap that. He wants to return to some sort of autarkic set of nation states who defend their vogue and make bilateral deals across the shared values of Western civilization and Christianity. I'm saying that as like taking him at his word what he wants. In terms of what he personally wants, I think he wants to be close to power, and he is. So I think he wants to ride that as long as he can.
Chris, the one thing I noticed about the tax returns that nobody seemed to have mentioned last night in the analysis, it was stamped clearly client copy. Nobody said that on the air. Now, that's a significant thing, I would think, to say that it wasn't the IRS.
Yes, it definitely was not the IRS. I mean, unless someone of the IRS stamped it with client copy to cover their tracks. Which, if I were the IRS and I was doing that, I might do. Now I sound like Wallace Shawn in The Princess Bride. Right, so yes, I mean, I think it came from someone in the... Now, the other thing I would say is that was the year, this is my favorite fun little speculative tidbit, that's the year he married Melania? I don't know. It's a joint filing. Do you think she's super psyched about the turn her life has taken? Manifestly not.
For me, one of the most dangerous things about the Trump presidency is not necessarily some of these policies, but the damage that he's doing to trust and faith in democratic institutions, like the press. And so my question for you is, let's pretend that in a couple of years we get a lovely, reasonable, rational president back in place. Do you think some of the damage which is being done now is going to be, restored, or do you feel like this is more, replaceable?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'll give you my honest assessment, which is no. I think that there's a question of how much he's a cause and how much he's a symptom. So I think in terms of this trust issue, I think he's largely a symptom, right? So I think he's like an opportunistic infection that is able to attack a sort of a body politic that's already weakened. I think there are ways in which the reaction to him is building up a set of antibodies that are really useful. I think there's a ways in which people's just average citizens rediscovering the value of the fourth estate and the sort of support for journalism and the recognition that democratic institutions can't be taken for granted is really actually doing some good work in reconstituting them. My overarching fundamental theory about what the infection or what the sort of ailment of the sort of Western body politic that gave rise to him is basically a kind of crudely Marxist one, which is that across the first world democracies have stopped delivering year-over-year gains to median workers. There's an amazing chart called the Elephant Chart by Branko Milicic. It goes like this, and it shows, I don't know why I'm describing a chart to you, but it shows basically 20 years of sort of peak globalization gains by decile across the world, okay? So the 10% poorest people in the world, the next 10%, the next 10%, right? And what the chart shows is that everyone in the world has seen huge material gains, right? Controlling for purchasing power from the world's poorest to the world's very richest, the top 10%, with the exception of basically this dip at 20% and 30%, which is the entire first world's middle class. So what has happened economically in the last 20, 30 years, even longer, is that the median person in India and China and Brazil have gotten more money. The plutocrats of the world, across the world, have become phenomenally rich. And the middle classes of the first world have been hammered. It just so happens the middle classes of the first world control the governments that have the most military and geostrategic power. So you get Brexit, you get Geert Wilders, you get the Front National, you get Donald Trump, right? What do you see in nation after nation after nation? You see, essentially, this sort of contempt for all these institutions of liberal democracy and the rise of these sort of reactionary forces. So to answer your question, like, to me, this fundamental redistributive problem has to be solved. That in the absence of a middle class that feels like it's getting a square deal, you are going to unleash a Pandora's box of horrible ills that will ultimately threaten democracy. That the social contract has been so torn up that, you know, getting a new president who has respect for democratic norms, like, that will stop the bleeding. But ultimately what has to happen at a deeper level is the mass of a society in the first world developed nations, in the OECD countries, the average voter has to feel like things are getting better for them in a real year-over-year sense. And in the absence of that, you will get what we're seeing now.
Chris, to go along with that, most of the people in this room, like myself, grew up in the time where John Kennedy was the president, or certainly in our college years, and the whole concept was government was the solution, not the problem. We then saw Reagan come in, and government was the problem. Let's tear it down. We don't need regulations. And we've gone on with that for really quite some time. And we're now seeing, with the Tea Party and with the crowd that's in there now, we're going to try to destroy the government. The only hopeful thing that I saw coming out of this election, and believe me, it was slim, was the fact that a lot of young people, for the first time, who've taken everything for granted, for the first time seem to realize that there are consequences to elections, that there are real changes to their lives and their parents' lives and maybe their grandparents' lives as a result of the way the vote turned out. And I am hopeful, at least on that case. How about you? Do you see any chance that there can be enough strength building in this to turn around this horror?
Yeah, so I think that, I do think there's like an incredible catalyzing effect that's happened, and I think the amount of organizing that's happening is really heartening. I think people showing up, overwhelming switchboard, showing up their Congress members' offices, like everything that's happened in that score, I think is a really hopeful sign. And I say that even, you know, obviously I share politics with those people, but I also mean that across, like, I was not one who sort of thought the Tea Party was silly or to be ridiculed. Like, I think citizens, it's hard to get people to show up to stuff. Citizens showing up at a congressional town hall is healthy. And so, yes, there's something catalyzing that's happened, particularly among, I think, younger voters, and in terms of the opinion data, it shows that younger voters don't have this kind of anti-government attitude that older cohort has. The other thing I would say, though, about this sort of idea of government as the problem is that was not the rhetoric of Donald Trump. Like, Paul Ryan is a Reaganist, right? Jack Kemp was his mentor, and the free market choice. You see this in the way they're selling the healthcare bill. The reason Donald Trump won is because he intuited that no one cares about that. There is no audience for that message. Donald Trump beat 17 other competitors because they were still singing out of the Reagan hymnal, and he was not. he made two promises on the first day that he announced. He was going to stick it to immigrants by building a wall, and he was not going to cut Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. Everything about the Trump appeal, to me, is a massive rhetorical departure from Reagan in that respect. And it's a rhetorical departure from Paul Ryanism, which is part of the weirdness of this bill right now, which is this kind of Frankenstein monster that is been crafted by Paul Ryan with this sort of Ryanist, Reaganist vision of individual choice in markets that is being sold by someone who doesn't care about that to a base that doesn't care about it and is on Medicaid. I mean, straight up. Like, McDowell County, where I was on Sunday, voted for him by 77% of McDowell County voted for him, and 50% of the counties on Medicaid. So good luck. Go tell those people about the wonderful magic of the market and choice when you take away their Medicaid. Trump has much more in common with Le Pen, right? Keep in mind, what is Le Pen's advantage right now in her campaign against the sort of center right? It's that the center right wants pension reform, it wants entitlement reform, it wants all the things Paul Ryan wants. Le Pen doesn't want to cut your pension. She just wants to keep the immigrants out, right? This sort of trade-off, this is this term, Herrenvolk democracy, right, which refers to the idea of a kind of social democratic enterprise for our people, which is if you look at these populist movements, right, what was the big argument made for Brexit? What was the thing that they put on the bus, the thing they ran their ads on, the things that got them to win Brexit? It was withdraw the payments to the EU, the money we're sending away, and put it into the National Health Service. That was the one-line argument. Stop giving money to those people and put it into our single-payer healthcare system. Right? So increasingly, I think the rhetoric of Reaganism and Ryanist sort of like free market choice has been completely bankrupted across the ideological spectrum. I don't think there's a domestic constituency for it anymore. And I think Donald Trump proved that, and I think that the fact that this healthcare bill, which I think is going to crash and burn, is another example.
We should let you make some money. So since we all in here buy and read books, most of us, I suspect, tell us about your new book.
Oh, I have a book coming out a week in 6 days. With Norton. It's called A Colony and a Nation. It's about democracy, race, and policing, and about what the meaning of law and order is. And fundamentally tries to answer the question from my reporting in places like Ferguson and Baltimore and Chicago and Charleston, and my own upbringing in New York in the peak crime years as a white kid from the outer boroughs. Sort of the question of like, why did we, and by we I mean white voters largely, make this system? Why do we make this thing? Why do we build a system in which 1/4 of every prisoner in the world is an American? 1 out of every 4 people in prison in the world is an American. We have 5% of the world's population. Why did we create the criminal justice system and policing regime we have? And the title and the sort of conceptual conceit of the book comes from a line from Richard Nixon's 1968 speech when he's in Miami, and he's talking about law and order and the unrest in the streets, and he says that, you know, black Americans don't want to, they don't want to be a colony in a nation. And I thought about that term. I thought about that term a lot because I was in Ferguson where it felt like the cops were an occupying army, and I went back and I did research about the founding of this nation, which was very much in reaction to the police. And if you don't believe me, I will quote from you from the Declaration of Independence, a line that I did not know existed in the Declaration of Independence, but in the Bill of Particulars about the sins of King George III, Thomas Jefferson writes, "He hath sent forth swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance." The cops. Now, the cops in those days are the customs officials. And stop and frisk is the ability of the customs officials to pull over any boat. John Hancock. Do people know John Hancock was a smuggler? The nation is basically founded by people engaging in gray market goods. And when the crown tries to crack down with their regime of stop and frisk and starts jacking people up, what happens is the colonists lose their mind. They start tarring and feathering and beating up customs officials. They engage in jury nullification. There are 38 cases brought by the customs official in 1756 in Newport, and they get 4 convictions because the colonists won't convict their own. The Fourth and Fifth Amendment are the heritage of a nation that was founded in response to tyrannical deployment of policing power. Much more than it was about taxes, it was about policing. And it was about policing because those figures were fundamentally approaching the people they policed as subjects. They had no accountability to them. And we have managed over the course of 200 years to recreate that very system. That's the book.
We have time for one more question, but before or after...
A colony in a nation.
After Chris answers that question, hold your applause because our president has an announcement. Last question.
Of the club, not the country.
So how many times did you see Hamilton?
So I saw Hamilton. I have seen Hamilton 3 times, and I will tell you quickly what they were. I saw Hamilton premiered in January of 2016 at the Public, I think. Am I right? Or was it 2015? 2015. Right, so it was January 2015, the Public it premiered. 4 months before that, Lynn invited me to go see a workshop production in a studio on the West Side. I had him on my show on Up in 2012 to debut one of the songs because he had done a concert at Lincoln Center while he was workshopping some of the songs. So I'd seen the White House production, the White House performance of the opening number. He came on and did my shot, which is basically the second number of the show. And then I went to see this workshop production. So I had high expectations. I've known Lynn forever. Lynn's a genius. In the Heights is fantastic. I saw that a number of times. I went over to this workshop production. It was the middle of the day. I did something I never do, which is that I left to go over there and then came back after work to go do my show. I never do that. I never leave in the middle of the day for 2 hours, but I thought I should go see this. I was so blown away by this workshop production that I distinctly remember sitting down the steps of Brownstone on 46th Street in Hell's Kitchen as I was walking back to work, just being like, what am I doing with my life? Like, I'm going to go do an hour-long cable news show? Like, who cares? How can I know, this is someone I know from the time we were 12 and 13. We did theater together. It's like, he's doing that? So that was my reaction to it. I also texted Lynn, can I invest? And he was like, no. True story. He's like, we're already closed up, which is a bummer because... so I knew immediately. I came back to my office. I was like, it is instantly canonical. It will be in the canon of great works of American art. Believe me. And then I saw it at the Public, and then I went and saw it again on Broadway. So I've seen it 3 times. But in some ways, nothing's ever going to recreate that first time. And I was going in with no hype, right? I mean, I knew Lynn, I knew a few songs, so I walked in like.
It's just a simple announcement. Right now, both Chris and Lin-Manuel are honorary members of the Silurians. Thank you. That was great.